Welcome to another episode of Financial 15. Kevin and I are ready to go. Lots of great information. This is continuing our original series on housing. Lots of other videos we've already created. We talked about why the prices are so high. We've talked about whether or not this is a bubble. We looked at some things they could do to slow down the market. Now we're looking at the impact of all of those trends coming together and asking the question, will the next generation be able to afford a home? You're going to want to stick around.
As Clint just commented, this is the fourth episode in our housing series, our original Becker Orr Original Series that we're doing. You can see the other three episodes on our YouTube channel. You can like us on Facebook or go to our website at beckerorr.com to really visualize what we've got here. So Clint, to start us off, will the next generation be able to afford housing? What kind of history do we have on this?
Yeah, we need a bit of context before we dive right into that question. And the context, the history in Canada is definitely one of home ownership. It's a cultural rite of passage, it seems, that at some point we all try to buy a condo, we buy a house, we do something where we get equity in the property. And the data certainly bears that out. What's on the screen is data from Statistics Canada. It looks at 2006, looks at 2016, that 10-year period. And it looks at home ownership rates across provinces, also gives you the Canadian average, and you can see pretty much across the board, these are high numbers, Kevin. You're looking at 60 to 70% pretty much in every province. Is that much of a surprise for you?
No, I mean, the two-thirds that we're getting, I mean, even when I was around, I mean, it was sort of ingrained in me that you got to a certain age, you bought a home, you wanted to own the property. It was a matter of, this was something that you had to do, a rite of passage as you move forward. And as we see, the numbers may have shrunk a little bit over that 10-year time frame, but it's still pretty much that two-thirds of everybody still owning a home. Now, if we do 2020 numbers, we'll probably see them slightly down again, but it's nowhere near what you're going to see other places in the world. So yeah, I think this is more of it's a cultural scenario. It's ingrained in us that we want to get some sort of home ownership going forward.
Yeah, and even if we dive a little deeper, because that was provincial. If you look at some of the cities, going by all the major cities, you can see them on the screen there in Canada. Again, 2016 data here from the census, from Statistics Canada. And even those hotbed markets, Kevin, the Torontos, the Vancouvers, the Montreals, the ones we often hear where people say, oh, that's definitely a bubble. Even those have very high home ownership rates. You're talking still 60, 70%, with the exception of Montreal at about 55 yes. There. But overall, was pretty high numbers on the screen.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I agree. I mean, I think that at least specifically in Western Canada as well, you see a lot of home ownership just because of the space that's available and everything else along those lines. Whereas you find that Quebec and Montreal, being that they tend to be more European in nature in Quebec, you seem to have a little bit less in that ownership scenario. And we'll probably figure out why that is going forward. But you're right. I mean, on general, these are things that we need to look at. And if we compare that to the US, I mean, as you see, we're at least 4 or 5 percentage points higher than what the Americans are. And again, that's something that we can see. Is this going to be able to continue going forward?
Yeah, and we're going to dive into that as well. A quick comment here. We're talking home ownership. A reminder, that's not just a house. If you buy a condo and you own the condo, that also qualifies as home ownership. So really, if you're not a renter, whether it's a condo, whether it's a house, in these statistics, that would qualify you as a homeowner. A quick comparison here, see how Canada stacks up against other major cities in the world. And you can see Canada, by and large, has very high home ownership rates. If you look at Paris, for example, they're at like 33%, or Berlin, or Tokyo, or Los Angeles, Hong Kong, all of them on the chart there are pretty much lower than the Canadian cities, which are on the high end. All the major Canadian cities, much higher home ownership rates when you compare them to other major cities around the globe. Quick note on the data here. This was done by RBC Economics Research. There are different timetables because each country, each city releases their data at different times, but it's a nice comparison. And do these numbers kind of stack up with what you thought would look like, Kevin?
Yeah, I think it is. And I mean, if we sort of take a look at where it is, it would look at more to me the way that the development of countries have gone going forward. In Europe, you're seeing that they've been developed for a long period of time. So there's less and less home ownership from there. Then you get to the Americans, which are in there. Whereas if you take a comparison, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, we're dealing with two countries in similar scenarios. Large land mass, small population, and you'll see a lot of home ownership. I see that Sydney and Auckland are on the high end, whereas everything else goes from there. So yeah, I think that trend has been there just based on some of those factors alone. What else can we look at based on what's going forward with all these ownership scenarios?
Yeah, one more set of charts here. This is going to be more relevant data because it's in the US, so a better comparison for Canada, closer to home. Also, 2019 numbers you're looking at. This is from roofstock.com, the 2019 American Community Survey. That's where they got the data, and they're looking at what they consider large U.S. cities. So they just had a number in the sand there for population. Once you get over the number, they considered it large, and they're looking at the large U.S. cities with the lowest home ownership rates. And some of them might be a surprise. And most folks think Cleveland, Ohio. Well, one, is that a large U.S. city? Technically, it is according to these metrics. And there's only a 40% home ownership rate. And I will note New York on the list there at about 32%. That's for all of New York City. They include all the boroughs together. I imagine Staten Island and Queens probably drag that average up, in a place like Manhattan, which has home ownership rates of about 22, 23%, are probably below there. But even then, even if you average it all out, New York City still very low home ownership rates. What are your thoughts when you see these numbers here, Kevin?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And I think you're right. I think majority of all these numbers that we're seeing right there are all the greater areas, sort of like the GTA in Toronto. They categorize the greater Toronto area, or that, because I know that Austin's not an incredibly large city. I mean, especially when you're talking Texas, you've got Houston and Dallas, which of course are both on there. San Antonio's a bigger place to look at. There's a variety of them. But yeah, it sort of shows that it's across America. It's not just one certain area. You're not stuck in the Northeast scenario, or you're not stuck strictly in California. It's across the area that you're starting to see these low home ownership rates in the United States. And as mentioned before, I mean, you take Montreal, which are a low city. I mean, we're 15 points higher almost, or 10 to 15 points higher in ownership rate. So, I mean, this is definitely something that, again, more of a Canadian scenario, more of that sort of Australian thing. You're starting to see the U.S. go here. And I mean, I imagine that the numbers that we would find if they were in Europe are probably even lower than this going forward as well, just because of the size of the cities and everything else. What other points on home ownership, or why are we seeing this trend come through?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. A quick note here, all the major Canadian cities, you're right, the Toronto, the Vancouver, the Montreal, all of them are higher than these rates. They wouldn't even make the list here. Just to give you an idea, the gap in home ownership, when you look at the major Canadian cities versus the major U.S. cities, the major global cities, it's certainly a cultural rite of passage. It's still certainly ingrained in many Canadians. We have to own property, and that's reflected here in the data. In terms of why are we seeing that, Kevin, what are your thoughts? Why do you think we're seeing these low rates? In that follow-up question for, do you think Canada is going to follow that trend?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first one for low rates is as the cities become bigger and become a little more congested. I mean, if I take New York for an example, there's really no place to buy. And if you do want to buy, I mean, you're paying an astronomical rate to be able to do it. It's not affordable housing. I mean, I know just comparisons of the area of Tribeca in Manhattan, you're looking at $3.7 million for an average house price. That's not substantial for everybody. And what you're finding is that more and more people are going to have to start renting because there's just not that land. Or if you want to be close to the activities that are in the central core of an area, I mean, if you don't want to live 2 hours outside of it, you're going to have to rent because there's just nothing there to buy. So I think you're seeing this trend moving forward in what they call the larger cities. That's part of one of it. And I mean, do I see Canada going this way? To a point, I think we will. I mean, millennials are looking at more of a lifestyle scenario, possibly, as opposed to home ownership and things along those lines. And they're the big buyers of the market right now. Mm-hmm. How would you translate some of these things?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I do think Canada's going to follow that to an extent, not across the board. There's certainly regional differences. We do have a lot of land mass, a lot of differences across the country. But if you look at the major cities, the Torontos, the Vancouvers, the Montreals to some extent, those ones I think could follow that U.S. route, certainly amongst the large cities here we have on the screen. And if you remember from one of our prior videos, we talked about Toronto specifically. And in 2019, before the pandemic, it was the fastest growing metropolitan area in all of North America. I mean, so there's lots of people going to Toronto, and there's only so much space, right? So eventually, all those people want somewhere to live. That drives prices up. That's one of the factors. There's others, but that's certainly one of the factors that drives prices up. So if you want to live in the hub of the activity, as we're seeing in the U.S., as we're seeing in Europe, often that means either you have to pay a lot to own or more likely you end up renting. And I could see that happening eventually in Canada in the major cities. Will it happen in 5 years, 10 years? I'm not sure. I think it'd be generational to your point. Probably not the current generation, but maybe the generation after that, or maybe even the one after that. We could get rates like this for home ownership in Canada. But I do think that's on the horizon. Eventually in those major cities, if the trends continue, you could have a generation that frankly, not all of them are going to be homeowners. It'd be a much smaller home ownership rate than what we currently see. You think I'm off base there?
No, I think that's a perfect description of what's going on. Because, yeah, I mean, if we really take a look at it, all we're dealing with is we're seeing history being repeated over and over again. I mean, the Europeans are basically the first developed nation settlers. And as we see, there's less and less affordability in their big cities. You take that to the U.S., which is 250 years old, roughly, and we're seeing the same thing going on there. Canada, Australia, we're smaller countries, not in population, not so much in landmass, but we haven't been around as long. But as we continue to grow in that format, I think you'll see the same thing. Larger cities getting bigger, less expanse, less we can deal with it. So I think you're right on the money with everything we've got there. Anything else you want to add in regard to will you be able to afford a home down the road?
I think we covered all the bases there. A quick reminder for everyone, if you do have questions, maybe even a topic you want us to cover for a different video, get a hold of us. We're happy to help out. You can see it on the bottom of the screen there, chatwithclintonkevin.com. That's part of our website. You can go there, fill in the form. We'd love to hear from you. Any parting comments, Kevin?
Yeah, I think this has been good. This is the start of our original series basis. We've done one now. We will continue to bring these out as we find topics that we think really need to be dove into far and do a deep dive so that everybody can start to get that done. But otherwise, no, you've covered everything well. I'm finished with everything I can say.
All right, we'll be back again very soon. Everybody take care.